images to talk to. And is everybody seeing that fine?
Yes.
Great. I can still see Anne-Marie there. Well, one of the opening gambits that I was asked to talk about is how I discovered these, and I'm just going to show you some examples that Anne-Marie's forwarded, all of which appear in her book and in text she's written. And my entry point to finding these was I was working on a text and project and had a residency at the Red House, which is William Morris's house in Bexley Heath in London. And if you know it, he was a great medieval revivalist, obviously. I'm sure he's known to all of you. And whilst I was there, they were pouring pilgrim badges as a kind of summer workshop, and they actually had commissioned one for the house. But the work I was working on, I was there, was writing about these double coconuts, which are extraordinary coconuts from the island of Preslin in the Seychelles. And these double coconuts would fall from the tree and then float. And they floated all around the world. And huge numbers of storytelling has grown around them, these kind of wandering genitalia. And they look remarkably anatomically like a woman from the back and the front, which is extraordinary, and the same scale. They've been used in kind of erotic, they had erotic uses. They were both revered and feared and pursued almost to the point of extinction, but they're still growing. And in fact, the Duchess of Cambridge and William were presented one for a wedding gift because they honeymooned in Seychelles. So they still have this kind of extraordinary erotic currency. And they also found their way into religious settings. So they became prayer cups, they became bowls in Islam, and lovely stories about them being kind of, you know, bodies or corpses of mermaids. Anyway, I was reading about these, I was aware of these pilgrim badges, and then I stumbled across Anne-Marie's fantastic essay called Wandering Genitalia. And there was a lovely kind of synergy between this, the idea of these walking vulvas and these motile sexual organs that were depicted on the badges that seemed to have a kind of radical modernity about them, despite them being so old and quite shocking to the modern eye in some cases. So I began becoming quite fascinated by the kind of sexuality in those, the hybridity, the promiscuity, the difficulty in reading them. And from reading loads of different accounts of them, starting with Anne-Marie's essays and then going very widely from art historians, archaeologists, and going through a really interdisciplinary kind of basis, I started drawing as many as I could, and I collected them in this book. So that was my starting point into them. Do we want to go on more about the work that I've done, or should we talk about your starting point? How do we want to do this as a kind of...
Oh, why don't I say my starting point, because that brings us also to the point where we met, I guess.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So my starting point was as a literary medievalist and a literary scholar, and I when I first encountered reproductions of the Bawdy badges, I thought I was going to write a book about medieval obscenity, which in text, so obscene texts in the medieval German tradition. And there are some medieval German comic texts in which genitalia actually go about and move through the world and have a bunch of adventures of different kinds. They're trickster figures. And so I was writing about them, and then I found these actual images that showed these little creatures that I had read about, and I realized that there were actually these material objects. And I wrote the essay that Melanie is talking about. I went to London, and it was early on, in order to look at medieval badges, and found that both the VA was closed, the Victorian Albert Museum and the British Museum, they both closed their medieval exhibitions because they were reorganizing them completely. But instead, a mutual friend put us in touch with one another, Melanie, and I was just intrigued. It's a really It's absolutely fascinating for me. It's so intriguing and wonderful to talk to you about this work, to talk to you and to see what you make of it, how you interact with it. I think my approach is pretty resolutely historical, in the sense that I am trying to understand what they were and what they meant and how they functioned in their own time. But as we talk to each other in our dialogues, I begin to see possibilities in the past that I missed because of what you're seeing in the present. And so, and it turns out that our interests intersect around a lot of different planes or scales, I suppose. So one of the things we talked about as we were chatting before all of this started was the fact that we're dealing with images that are shocking to some people, that still have the power to shock. And as someone who works historically, I don't I think that I don't encounter that as much in my everyday interactions, in my writing, or in my discussions with scholars. But that's an interface I think that you may have to consider more as you bring your work out into the world. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. We touched on, I suppose that's really what fascinated me about them, that these images were widespread, they were everyday, they were part of everyday life and costume. They weren't hidden, they weren't embarrassed. We talked about, with plenty of kind of obscenities in church pews and misericords at entrances. And there's a kind of, it's interesting to me that they were possibly used to kind of shock the evil eye, or just to kind of have an appropriate protective role then, but also clearly there was great humor in them. This wonderful kind of pendant badge with moving parts shows so clearly the kind of huge humor and parody in them. And I love the little string, and I hadn't seen this image, but this was my first foray into animation, of actually just taking one of my drawings and animating it with string, making myself laugh out loud in the process. I was, and I kind of, what I became really fascinated in the kind of level of obscenity is that it both shocks and amuses greatly, and also seems to kind of undercut a huge amount and burst certain kind of pomposity. This image is Phyllis riding Aristotle, which is obviously a kind of what's the word, a kind of diss on his manhood, that he's being tamed and ridden by a woman. But it's all in, and the idea of kind of philosophers being well known and mocked by the general public, and that being and funny. And I suppose we live in such prolific and in the world at the same time can be by drawing and I'm kind of really interested in that we don't think of the medical kind of imagery as an everyday that children would have seen, you know what I mean? It's got many functions. So yes, I think it is something I'm gonna have to deal with though. I'm planning to do an exhibition of sculpture and new film in November, and they were concerned when I was doing workshops that people should be over 21, which is extraordinary because the age of consent in England is 16, right? And they've since backtracked on that, but it was a kind of, I was surprised to have to remember that these are shocking to the contemporary eye, but also extremely funny, right? And I think that's their beauty, that debates or works with the shock.
Would you go back to the Phyllis and Aristotle, the Aristotle and Phyllis badge? because, or your drawing of this badge, because there's something really interesting about it that I can say from the point of view of a medievalist about this image and how this, so this story, this is the story of how this story is absolutely ubiquitous in the late Middle Ages. And it's a story of how Aristotle, who is the tutor of, he's the great philosopher, and he's the tutor of Alexander, and he wants to break up Alexander's, it depends, his relationship with this woman Phyllis, who in most of the stories it's actually a legitimate relationship. And so in order to defend herself, Phyllis humiliates him by basically causing him to lust after her. And so this image without the penis, this image of her riding on Aristotle's back, is found in texts, it's found in wall paintings, it's found in frescoes, it is found absolutely everywhere. What's different about the badge, and there are two badges I think that survive with this image, is the fact that the badge is penis. The other images don't. The other images that I've seen where you see Phyllis writing Aristotle drawn, say in the City Hall of Cologne, we believe it was there. They imply his arousal, but they don't show the arousal. So what that suggests to me is that the badge itself is functioning in a different context in the Middle Ages, right? That you can't, just as you and I can talk about this, we can have an audience of interested adults here to look at this, but we have the medieval ages too had a sense of appropriate contexts for things, but some things that we would not consider appropriate context, like bare bottoms in church, right, were okay in the Middle Ages. So it's a shifting boundaries, but not the lack of boundaries in the Middle Ages. Yeah.
Well, and this image of Venus at the forge you were talking about earlier, as well, as terms of not being about sexual attraction, but courtly love and the whole contractual kind of nature of that.
So this badge is held in a museum in Germany, and I have been trying to get an image of this badge for I don't know how long. I was also hoping to go see it, but obviously that hasn't been able to happen. Because this image really fascinates me. There is in the literate culture of the High and Late Middle Ages, there's an enormous amount of literature in which personifications of different kinds come alive and talk and do things in the world. Lady Venus, Lady Fortune, and on and on. And so Lady Venus or Lady Love is always a courtly lady, and she's a very fine lady, and she's a kind of, Barbara Newman wrote a book about this where she called her a kind of the goddess figures. So they're very powerful demigods at any rate. And she is often shown at the forge, fully clothed, of course, and making some important object. So this funny badge is a parody of elite culture and a parody of courtly love. And it just shows how much the badges show us these different kinds of cultures in the Middle Ages in conversation, in dialogue, or making fun in contest with one another, contesting one another.
Sure. And the whole kind of idea of forging a penis to kind of replace men, or, it amuses me hugely as well.
Well, this is one of the things that's so striking about this corpus, if you will, of objects, of these surviving badges, is how many of these little penises there are. Sometimes sometimes they have wings, and sometimes sort of penis creatures. I call it, like this one. Yes, this is a very common image, with wings and with feet. But also in the pot in the pan that you showed, that actual image, which is, we'll talk about scale in a minute, that everywhere, so they appear as creatures in their own right. They appear attached to these odd, I don't know what to call this thing. This is just, yeah, this is a different context.
Sure.
than
I'm sorry, I just wanted to take the moving
altogether,
image away while
like,
you were talking.
yeah, what I call cooking. But you also have, I think, it showed one of the badges where people are holding them as though it's a sort of like way what she's forging, what Lady Venus or wherever it is forging there is an object that you see other badge people holding that object. Does that make sense? Holding an object like that.
Yeah.
And so it's as though these little genitalia, particularly the little penises, are functioning in a whole range of different metaphorical contexts.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously there's a kind of anti-Catholic one as well, where there's later images of nuns farming penises and trees, and that was a kind of anti-Catholic message, right? To kind of hint that women would be, because they weren't allowed to have sex, Catholic nuns, that they'd be kind of desperate, so they'd be farming their own.
I mean, I don't know if it's anti-Catholic. I would say because Boccaccio makes a great, Boccaccio and the Decameron has a story about that, about the gardener who pretends to be a deaf mute and lives happily in the convent, servicing the nuns for a long, long time. I think what it is, I don't think it's anti-Catholic. I think it's anti-institution. I think it's anti-church in this sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that's kind of the way I intuited them, right? Which is also is a kind of image of female empowerment and humor. The idea of kind of growing, cooking, roasting them oneself and harvesting them is kind of hilarious. But also, yeah, I mean, and kind of interesting that they're simultaneous with the more revered kind of ones with wings. Which obviously must have seeped in through a kind of Roman influence. They must have been familiar with that image or borrowed that image.
Well, I mean, this one has been caught, right? If you think of the others,
this one, yeah, this one is great. This one's being roasted alive, and this is the one that I did a 3-meter drawing of. I told you that was in my kitchen for a long time.
See, I wrote a whole article about this because I thought about these that they're being turned into food.
Yeah.
I mean, so we have the penis as a tool. Then we have them as sort of these moving animated objects that are always moving and mobile, sort of promiscuous in the world. But we have them as nourishment.
Yeah. As a kind of sustenance, right, which is really interesting as a kind of, the idea of a kind of fertility and providers of food. I just think this is a really funny, the idea that these kind of women are making a feast.
Yeah, and there are some badges as well that show women digging phalluses up from soil.
Yes, yeah, I've drawn that one. In fact, I mean, I've looked at these really exhaustively now. I've spent the last 5 years, and there aren't many digitized, I think, that I haven't found now, and it became a kind of obsession to try and to draw them all, to kind of bring them together in an assembly, because one of the things that interested me in your essay was not only are the badges motile, they've all got, vulva with feet. And even though the worm or phalluses, there's still a lot of wandering vulva, which is extraordinary, in pilgrims. But the image of them kind of in boots with a staff it's such a fantastic image of confidence and an ability to wander literally promiscuously. But I love the fact that those would also be on walking people, that these images would travel across Europe as well as in the imagination. And for me, it became a bit of an obsession to kind of find all the ones that have been found and bring them together again, which is what I'm working on now in a film, to kind of give them a kind of Bruegel-esque assembly where all these contradictory drives and readings are possible in the same space. Probably hugely historically inaccurate, but really interesting to me to see what they do with each other.
Well, I mean, I don't know when, who knows what's I don't know historical accuracy or inaccuracy. I don't know that's the especially interesting question for your work to be asking, unless you were doing a different kind of project.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Well, what I loved about them was the idea that they would travel to different places and then be copied or, you know, circulate in areas where they wouldn't necessarily have originated from. So the idea of kind of an authentic origin becomes a bit disputed, right? When some of these images, because they would have been a vernacular that traveled across Europe. And we talked a bit about this earlier. And I love the idea that different badge makers were at license just to reproduce them or make a version of them, not to copy them, but to make their own local versions. And I kind of feel like a bit of a time travel that I'm just doing that. I'm adding my versioning of them to part of an historical practice.
Yeah, it's part of the assemblage. Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly. And
And
part of the kind of evolving nature of them, that they get seen by an artisan from one place and then kind of reversioned and circulate again.
why have you decided to do animations with them? What would you talk about that, the process and
Sure.
yeah.
Well, first I was drawing them to make sense of them, because it always feels to me, I'm really interested in the idea of mimesis and not being to copy, not being to do an encyclopedia kind of, I mean, I wanted to gather them all together, but not to produce an encyclopedia or an exhaustive account of them, but to see what they do to and with each other. And I use drawing not to kind of copy them, but to really understand them, to really understand the mark making, to really understand the use of scale, to understand the humor and the architecture. Some of them are in these wonderful kind of framed assemblies. And for me, drawing them allows me to kind of really, you know, kind of become part of that world again, to actually make the marks, to make, some of them are very roughly hewn. They're very obviously only 2 or 3 centimeters, and they would have been made with, you know, scratching out stone, and they would have worn away. And so some of the badge, and they've also been found in rivers, so they would have eroded that way. And it's very hard to tell now where those marks come from, you know, whether we're looking at marks that have been eroded in time or that they were just very roughly hewn because they were so tiny. But when you draw them or blow them up bigger, it becomes a whole language of mark making, which is really exciting to me. Some of them incredibly detailed and kind of realistic in a more European tradition, others much more expressive, especially when you blow them up. The marks become quite extraordinarily expressive. So that was really important. And my first job was just to draw them. And then this really was my first animation. I was asked to do something about touch and intimacy in lockdown, just for an Instagram site, a kind of whole collection of artist gifts. And then I actually, from those, started animating them because they amused me, to bring them to life. And like you were saying, some, you know, it was lovely to find out that some of them were actually articulated and animate, but also to hint that they weren't static, you know, that they're not static images that were final versions of anything. They were part of an ongoing discourse, an evolving dialogue. And there was something you wrote about beautifully in your book, which I've had a sneak preview of, is the way that these images would, not just the secular one, not just the sexual badges, but badges generally, would activate a belief system, would make you an active participant in a set of devotional practices, rather than making you a passive consumer of an image. And I think this is a way that contemporary art really interests me, that it can make you an active participant in discourse, an active participant in a whole kind of set of political viewpoints, an active participant in a set of semiotic dialogues, a semiotic wheel between texts of the exhibition catalogue or the review, between the conversations happening in the show, between the artifacts in the show, and any kind of research that's led up to the exhibition. I suppose I'm so used to seeing contemporary art being this very vital set of practices that brings all these different signing processes together in one place. And increasingly what they're calling the phygital, between the physical and the digital, that a show might exist in both places at once. And that is something that seems so key to the medieval imagination, that one's always operating with material culture leading into a sense of the virtual, especially whether it's the divine or whether it's a shared humor, or whether it's a kind of meme-like communication in the way that the images are legible to across the whole continent, which is a really interesting phenomenon to me. Even if they have different local applications or different local readings, they still function across the whole continent. So it's the urge to animate them just seemed, it seemed really important to bring that to the fore. So I'll just begin. I have an animation I'd love to share, but obviously just digital, that they kind of hover between being quite visceral and physical and painted, and then quite and then digitized. So I will give the link afterwards. But yeah, the desire to bring them together and put them in communion with each other was really important.
When you began by talking about that you drew your first step of exploring them was to draw them. And that reminded me that, well, my first step when looking at these images was to use language and to describe them closely, to meticulously describe without evaluation what I was actually seeing. And I wonder if there's so we approach them through different means, but in part we approach it that way because these really are strange images. I mean, symbolically, it's not clear what they mean. It's not so much that they're mysterious, it's more that they're enigmatic images. And it's though they, at least for me, looking at them and looking at some of the ones that are very strange, I just don't understand what's going on. That the first step is to just simply see, which my seeing is done through language, to make sure I'm taking in everything that's there in order to understand it. Then we also come to the question of their materiality, right? That the medieval badges themselves, the ones that survive that we have, are made out of this very cheap material that in its that when it was new was very, very shiny and was often painted or decorated in some way. So it's easy to make. It's easy to make the molds. If they're made in. You make a mold and then you pour molten pewter basically into the mold. The molds, if you're making a simple mold, they're easy to make. It's ridiculously easy to make the actual object. I mean, just ridiculously easy. I've done it myself. Anybody can do it as long as you've got a set of gloves so that you can hold these hot things. And so that their materiality also means that I know what I was going to say, that pewter takes marks and fine detail really, really well. So you have this medium that is it's easy to use, they're cheap to make, but you can get an enormous amount of detail in it. And then you can paint it and decorate it or embellish it and use it in all kinds of different ways, and then bringing them to life. So you pointed this out to me, Melanie. I hadn't realized it until you pointed it out in one of our talks. So in my book, I do something that is a bit unusual for scholars. Each chapter opens with a little fictional sketch that I wrote myself, in which I have medieval people doing things with badges. And it was because perhaps it was a parallel sort of impulse to the one that you felt, that I wanted to animate them in a certain way. I wanted to be able to imagine them and imagine people using them, how they circulated, how they moved, what they did for people, how they possibly could fit into this world of this medieval world where they were ubiquitous, but from a modern point of view, the point of view of a literary scholar, medievalist historian, totally absent from modern imaginings of their
time.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the idea as well of adding color back to them was really important.
Yeah.
And I haven't tried to do that in any kind of facsimile of accuracy. but what really interested me at the time, that obviously when they were made, the idea of the four humours was still circulating. It was really influential, and it was an idea that your body was always in flux and always in a dynamic, right? Which is an idea we're kind of returning to with different language and different drivers for that change and that dynamism. But one of them that I read about was an American system called the temperament index, which looks at your hormone levels and neurotransmitters and gives you these kind of personality types. And it's been actually used in court cases to incriminate people, to say they're, you know, testosterone driven or kind of estrogen fueled, or, you know, which is a kind of insane science. But it really interested me now that we can see dopamine and testosterone and estrogen and you know, oxytocin, all the sex hormones under microscopy now and in electron micrographs. But the only way we can find them is to use polarizing filters, which gives them a kind of rainbow opalescence, right, which is a kind of fantastical one. It's lens based or digital, it's not real, but it does open up this incredible palette of colors. I was really thinking about the ways in which scientists try and entice us to look at all electron micrographs really are grey, because they're reading sound and translating that into image, but it's always through a polarizing filter, which gives it this spectral effects. And I really enjoyed the idea of working with this kind of spectral color, including fluorescence, and laying it back on these badges, which would originally have had perhaps glass eyes or painted features. So I'm not kind of trying to restore them historically, but I really had a lot of fun giving them these kind of rainbow aesthetics. And obviously I'm aware that, you know, the kind of idea of a rainbow is also one that's to do with kind of queer representation, and kind of giving that, you know, throwing that into the mix, this kind of searing kind of brightness back to them, and adding to this kind of ambiguity that they have.
I mean, the way we see them now is not how they looked originally. So just
no.
recoloring them is so important. They look so, all of the images show when you see them in a museum or in a collection, they're basically, they've been tarnished by time.
Yeah. But I do kind of, I think that tarnish kind of interests me as well, because there's something rather that shows the contrast of them, even though they look rather sad, because they're kind of dark and worn away, but there is something rather beautiful about the tarnish, or at least some of the ways that some of the marks, the original marks, have been kind of slightly flattened out or dulled, so I drew them all in black ink, and then lay the color on that, because I kind of like the idea that I was kind of, you know, not trying to restore them as to some kind of ideal moment, you know, but also that somehow if they're all silver, it's very hard to see the contrast, but the way they're photographed, usually in black and white, in this tarnished state, really makes the mark making really pronounced, which may not be the case in under when they're new or under daylight.
Melanie, what we have to talk about is scale, because scale is one of the weirdest things and most interesting things about them, and about what you're doing with them, because we see all these images, but what the images don't capture is how small the medieval objects are. So I have this little tiny, this is a replica of a religious badge. Can you see it?
Yeah.
It's Wilsnach, and so it's my hand behind it, and it's very, very small. I looked up again the sizes of some of the the captions here show the sizes, so you should, but basically, so this 23 by 21 millimeters, which is about basically just call it an inch by an inch. An inch by an inch, and that little, so, and all of them are within that within that range, as it were. There are some that are a little bit larger. This one is a little bit bigger, 33 by 19, 33 millimeters. So
Tiny.
tiny bit tall, but they're still tiny. And so they're all really small, and yet they were worn by people. They were worn on cloaks, or they worn on, and we know they were worn because you can see the attachments. So you can see on the one that you've drawn, there's a
Yeah,
whole
that's
line.
actually a pin, right?
That's the pin. That's the pin that's still intact on the back of the badge. So this has implications for how they were read and used, because it means that you have to get close to somebody to be able to see it
Mm,
and
mm.
read it. And the image that you showed previously, the one that the little penis in the pan,
Oh yeah.
yeah, um,
Okay.
which
Let's
has
flick
this
back.
thing, which is it. So this is an absolutely, this object is so small.
Mm,
It's extraordinary. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about what that means, that it's like a half inch
mm.
by, yeah, it's that just to pull, to put that little string. Can you see the eyelet at the bottom of the pan?
Yeah.
And how the string is attached around that little eyelet, so you can pull it. To attach that string and then to pull the thing, it's like threading a needle, basically.
Mm.
You have to focus in, it's really precise, and then it's so small.
But that's, I mean, the mark making at that kind of scale is
Mhm.
quite detailed, but when you blow it up, it becomes so expressive
Yes.
because they actually look rather roughly hewn then. And that does really interest me, to see what happens when you blow them up. I'll just take us. These are just I started cutting the figures out. I've painted a whole lot more since I made the book, actually, in the film, in my exhaustive survey of them. And I'm enjoying cutting them out to make them suggest some ways in which they might be arranged in 3 dimensions in a picture space. My first animation is very flat and head on, but I've also been sculpting them. So I blew them up to kind of 8 foot, and where these tiny marks then become really extraordinary when they're blown up. And I find this really interesting. What happens if they become architectural, and what happens if the figures become life size. So this is 3 meters square. They're so strong as images once they become this large and architectural. But I kind of think what's really interesting, they are tiny in scale, but like you were saying that when one sees, like, the way an icon works is then to kind of actually project oneself into communion with a bigger set of ideas, right? So they become life size in the imagination.
Mhm.
And I suppose I'm kind of really interested in playing with that.
Mhm.
Excuse me, Melanie.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Anne-Marie and Melanie, I'm just mindful of the time. We've had a lot of questions asked.
Oh.
We could all, I'm sure, sit and just listen. You're both moving in such interesting directions, and the images are so fabulous. I do want to give people a chance to weigh in. Would you mind if we just had some questions, and then if
Sure,
we have time
yes.
after, you can follow up? Yeah.
Go ahead. Questions.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So I've made a list. Just give me a moment while I call
I
it
will
up
stop
here.
sharing.
One question that came up, which is easy to address because you've sort of skirted around it, but neither of you has said it directly. So for people who aren't as familiar with the badges, is the ways in which they were embellished and decorated. Do you want to maybe just offer a few explicit comments on what they would have looked like in the period and how we know that?
So the Wilsnacht badges, we know that they had red paint on them, for example, and we know that because there are just a very many of these survive, and there are 1 or 2 where the paint can still be detected. But because this is a religious badge that's connected to a very popular charismatic site in northern Germany, it appears many times in altarpieces and paintings where pilgrims, so medieval altarpieces that show pilgrims, and these pilgrims are wearing a recognizable Wilsnacht badge on their clothes, usually on their hats, actually, and it's always painted red. And other badges do have traces of paint. Some of the badges also are basically made in what's called a kind of fretwork or open work, so that you can see through it literally. And when you turn them over, they have little, I call them pinchbacks on the back. So it's, for those of you who had paper dolls when you were children, it's the way you would put the clothes on the dolls, you know, you print. So anyway, what this says to us is that those badges were made with the intention of putting a backing on of some kind. And there are a very few that survive with some kind of gold or silver backing, paper, a flat, a fine sheet of some kind of intact.
And this is what Melanie was saying as well,
Yeah,
right? Perhaps
yeah.
having a
And
piece
some
of
of them
colored glass
also,
behind you.
so
Yeah.
so that is gold, and then there are stones on it, cheap stones that are imitating gemstones that are green in this one particular case, and then this pewter is bright silver.
Mm.
So it's very colorful and
Look
eye-catching.
at Roman badges. I mean, they were all already using enamel, so it's very possible that they would have been painted
Yes.
Sure.
as well.
Yeah. Lovely. Andrew wants to know, why are so many found in the Netherlands, so few in London, and none in Ireland?
Ah, none in Ireland?
This
There
is
are
what
some in
Andrew
Ireland.
has asked this, yeah.
There are some in Ireland, and actually the Museum of London has quite a lot.
Excellent. Maybe do you want to expand on that, Melanie? Andrew is unaware of them. He says that in his home of Ireland, there are none. So
There
what
was
can
an
you tell him?
exhibition, I can't remember, but there was an exhibition of them in Ireland in the last 5 years. I'd have to research that, sorry.
That's okay. It's a
I
good
didn't know.
lead for him to follow up on. Yeah.
So these, I mean, I have to remind everybody that there are 300, roughly 300, 350 of these Bawdy badges that survive. And this is a very small subset of all of the surviving badges that we know. There are about 20,000 plus that actually survive. And these Bawdy badges that we're looking at do come from, they are localized. They're most common in a specific economic, social, political space, which is the Low Countries. And there are more have been found in London than were previously known.
Mhm.
But basically Low Countries, including France. That's so. My guess about the Bawdy badges and why they're concentrated in those areas is that there were specific cultural practices such as carnival or other things, and lots of cities, and that these badges were associated with those lifestyles and those places, and probably also something like carnival, which was an annual happening in most of these places.
Excellent.
There's a question there on them being resolutely heterosexual. I'd just quite like to address that one, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is that all right if I jump the queue?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
Just because that feels really important, because actually I see a huge amount of sexual ambivalence in them.
Mhm.
And I'm not suggesting that there was a great tolerance for a more kind of pansexual sexuality in the medieval era, but in terms of the representations, they're really, really ambiguous. And I've, in my drawings, really drawn that out. And even though there's a kind of focus on the phallus, often they are dildos, and there are two women making them. There's all kinds of sexuality set up. Some of the men some of the pregnant images look like men. There's a kind of great queering, and partly in the way that they're made, and partly in the way perhaps that they've eroded, but there's a really rich sexual ambiguity in them, which really fascinates me. And that's really important, actually, that I'm, in my film anyway, I'm really not drawing out the kind of heteronormativity of it at all. I'm seeing them very much as a place where sexual power is challenged and subverted and ridiculed, which I think Anne-Marie's written about as well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And I thought a lot about that with these badges of where the various penises are being cooked in different ways. And it seemed to me that wasn't really about sexuality one way or the other at all.
No.
It was about something completely different. And that, you know, that it was about reproduction, but that doesn't have to be about sexuality either, really.
I mean, I think that's one thing that's really interesting about them, is that they're highly sexual. There's humor, there's ambiguity, but they're not erotic.
They're not erotic. I agree.
Yeah, they're definitely not pornographic. I mean, they're representing something that's very deep culturally. What about the sort of apotropaic interpretation of these? You know, Anne-Marie and I have talked about their talismanic properties. Like, are they used to ward off evil? Are they used to avert bad luck, to bring good luck? How do badges function in terms of that level, culturally and anthropologically?
Well, I mean, I have a whole chapter on this in my book. So I think that in the medieval world, we know that people used images to ward off evil, to frighten evil. And in the book, just for the sake of making the argument, I base my argument off from a cultural historian, Ruth Mellencamp, who talks about, who's talking about iconography, and who's basically saying we've misunderstood a lot of this grotesque imagery from the Middle Ages. We have misunderstood who the audience is for these images. The audience is not necessarily primarily other human beings. The audience are the world of invisible forces, most of which are malignant, who surround us everywhere. And that's a basic worldview, I think. She says, and I agree with that, in the Middle Ages, that the sense that the world is full of different kinds of forces, and many of them mean ill to us. So the thing is, I think that most of these, say, even a pilgrim badge can take on some of those amuletic or talismanic qualities, depending on the belief system, the belief that you infer to it. It can frighten off. For example, you by putting yourself under the protection of a great saint, you're sheltering from that, and that saint will frighten off the demons. And it's possible to see some of these badges also functioning those ways. They might confuse the demons, or demons, according to Mellencamp, demons are easily distracted, right? So comedy, or things that sort of distract demons, and then they go off and they would. So, but we can't say for sure that they were used in these ways, but they could have functioned in these ways.
They really proliferated in times of plague as well, which is really relevant.
Yes,
and
the timing matters, definitely.
Yeah.
Are they sort of like minor relics then, Anne-Marie? Especially for the pilgrim badges, they come into contact with the saints' bodies or remains, and they're imbued with some sort of supernatural essence?
So that for the religious badges, yes. You activated a religious badge, you acquired it at the site that you visited. They were for sale outside of these churches. In many cases, the canons, or the people who managed that holy site, also gave out the licenses to people to make and sell
Merchandising.
It was merchandising in a way. But the way that you then, as a pilgrim, needed to, I call it, activate the badge. And the main way to activate the implicit holiness of the badge would be to touch it to the shrine. And so the theologians were very clear. They were very clear that these were not relics. They were not relics. But it's also really clear that many people, maybe most people, pious people, weren't so concerned about that, and they saw them as being relic-like. They transferred.
Melanie, I want to switch gears now, just going back to your gorgeous images. One of the things that strikes me as so fascinating about your work is the way you're taking a small pewter object and, again, shifting media, right? So now you're making it into a paper cutout or a digital image. And one of the things I find fascinating about the sexual badges is that the imagery that we see depicted on these little badges appears in other media, as Anne-Marie alluded to, right? So you'll see them in manuscripts. So one of the badges I don't think you called up in your images, but I know you're both familiar with, is the penis tree. And this is one, for example, that we have painted on murals in churches in France, on dowry chests in Italy. It's a motif that appears throughout. And I wonder, Melanie, if in your research and your work, have you explored the sort of transposition across media that occurs in these images? Perhaps you could speak to that as an artist.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I've started to do that much more, because the badges are a kind of starting point, but then I think they existed in a semiotic world, where they were part of images in other things. So I've been looking at wall paintings and murals. I'm particularly interested in the badges because they were made by artisans, so easy to make, as Anne-Marie says, but I think some of them, like manuscripts are all commissioned by the church or commissioned by families, whereas badges, I think artisans could have made things to amuse themselves, unlike anywhere else. And that really interests me.
But
what's
manuscripts are also made by artisans. By the late Middle
True.
Ages, there are workshops in places like Oxford and Paris where people are just where they're commissioning.
It's true, but
books of different kinds.
they're very expensive
Yes, they
in
are very
comparison,
expensive.
and time consuming. And so I suppose it's this idea of having a very, very cheap to make distributable thing. And I think they have been compared. So I think it's really important to look sideways, to look at the kind of other representations that were around, but as a body of images and or objects, they particularly interest me that they would have circulated beyond a kind of commissioning upper class as well, and been made by, and obviously, I mean, there are all kinds of incidences where misery chords and things would be really obscene and really funny or cartoonesque, and there were complaints about them where they let the artisans do what they felt like. And there are theories that shieling the gigs and things like that are the artisans having fun when they're allowed to make their own representations. And I suppose it's that spirit as well that I think some of the badges come from, kind of, almost like, just kind of bawdy humor. And
much like the marginal images that you'll see in very serious theological texts that are often a little bit raunchy, right? Where you get the sense that the illuminator in the scriptorium is just having fun with it, right? And
exactly. And I guess there aren't many remains of those things, right? So that's why
they really little window. They belong to this absolutely fascinating array of objects that show us ordinary people in the Middle Ages. That they were affordable to ordinary people, and ordinary people it shows them being able to, they were objects that they could purchase, that they could use. In the realm of religious objects, there's an explosion in the manufacture and sale of cheap, small objects they're for piety, little whistles, little itty bitty tiny reliquaries that are like folded, that you unfold and can set up for yourself. Pieces of little tiny pieces board that someone has carved out, and then they've tacked a couple badges onto it. So you're really seeing this is a realm of medieval life. It's very hard for us to see into, to get a sense of, because those people didn't have access to texts and to writing, which is what survives best, out of which we take most of our knowledge of the Middle Ages. And it also shows us that these ordinary people, that they had access to images, and that they wanted images, and that they used images. And we see them doing things with these images, even badges and things like that, manipulating them in different ways, which I think is fascinating. So I've seen in the course of all my looking a number of religious badges that have been folded, carefully folded, so that some aspect of that badge is on top. And what that says to me is that some person took that object and did something to it, or the person who made the board, and then they made themselves a little homemade altarpiece, if you will. And just coming into this realm of thinking of ordinary medieval people as not sort of the sort of pious and fearful and submissive, but rather as sort of actively engaging, as we know they must have, with their world. And
so Anne-Marie, that's a nice segue to Jonas's question that he's just posted. This distinction that you're both making between sacred and profane, is this anachronistic? Would medievals have seen it this way, or is there a fuzzier boundary for them?
Oh no, Jonas is right. It's a fuzzier boundary. And I think one of the places that shows it most beautifully are the vulva badges, which are dressed as pilgrims. And then we see these little vulva badges as pilgrims. It's a relatively common symbolism. So here you have, basically sort of the most profane and the most pious activities just simply overlaid on with one another. And sometimes even one of my very favorite ones shows this little vulva pilgrim with a staff, the pilgrim staff in one hand and a rosary in the other, which just goes that, anticipating Freud's ideas of symbolism by hundreds of years. Medieval people were well aware of this. And the fact that of course, medieval people made fun of the church. They made fun of clerical rituals. They made fun of clerics. They made fun of pilgrimage.
Yeah, and Jonas is following up with comments that echo what you're saying, right? The idea that we're all the inheritors of Victorian prudishness, and that medievals were much more earthy than we are, right? Living on farms, watching animals rut in the field. Their world is one that's much more connected to bodies, BODIES, and body things, right? Than we perhaps are comfortable with.
I mean, I
goes,
think
yeah.
perhaps it says something about my sense of humor, but I think they're witty sometimes, these objects as well.
Yeah. Nice. Melanie, are there any, I have a friend who works on stained glass in the south of France, and part of what has survived in archives are the beautiful cartoons that the glassmakers would draw first. So the sketches, right, that were then used as the basis.
No, I don't know those.
Yeah, I've never heard of that for badges. I don't know if any survive. They must have been drawn before they were created, right? But I don't know if anything survived.
I don't necessarily think so, because it's quite easy to etch into the stone.
Yeah.
Freehand, and they're so small that I think in a way you would work on a soft stone as a kind of it'd be pretty easy to kind of draw freehand into that. And I say one of the reasons I've been drawing them is to really kind of inhabit them and attend them, but when I have blown them up really big, it's kind of easier to work direct. So I'm not sure that there would have been. So I'm not sure that they would have been required that kind of degree of planning.
Some of them do. So some of the most
the complex ones.
The complex ones, and in those cases, we know that the molds were made by goldsmiths. That the church or the cathedral or the shrine would commission goldsmiths, who were of course highly skilled artisans, to make the designs for these.
I think the complex ones definitely would have needed planning and quite good physics to understand where the weak points would have been to stand up and things. Whereas some of the more crude ones, I think, not so much. But yeah, I think the I don't know, my instinct is that would have been a foundry making some for serious use and some for absurd use and some for carnival and some, from the same people, kind of carrying vernacular over.
And if the foundries are working in lead, they're making a lot of just absolute utilitarian objects like, what is it, cames? Is that what they're called for windows? The lead that you put glass in, right? And buckles and things like this. Lead is used for all kinds of things, as well as badges. Yeah.
And also makes you delirious, as we know.
Yes, exactly. They knew too.
I mean, they'd have gone quite mad smelting all that lead over a lifetime.
Well, they're often found the badges are often found in riverbeds. And one of the side projects Anne-Marie and I have often talked about doing, since I'm an environmental historian, is looking at the sort of byproduct of lead shavings being dumped into these rivers and the pollution, which is still sitting at the bottom of the European riverbeds, right? So sort of the pollution of stained glass and badge making and the impact on the environment, which was, definitely traceable.
Yeah, around the Seine and the Thames, I imagine it is pretty
bad, definitely. But listen, those are all the questions that were in the chat. If anyone else has not had a chance, I invite you now to post your comments. If I've missed, I apologize. Feel free. Well, wait for that, Melanie. Now.
World.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful article about, I thought when someone first mentioned this, I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. And then I read an absolutely fabulous article by Anatol Stefanovich, who's a linguist at the Free University in Berlin. And it's in this, it's in the catalog that you held up from the Europäisches Handelmuseum, matching catalogs. This, and he makes the most interesting argument for that emojis are when emojis are used in texting and so on as identity markers, that they actually resemble the uses of medieval badges. And I think he's right. And what that means is that the representative functions, the way they take on paralinguistic, I think that's the right term, paralinguistic significance for us in being able to communicate claims of identity. Links emojis in the digital world with badge wearing in the late medieval world. The importance that maybe it's one of the things that we, for good and for ill, very much have from them, the need to identify ourselves as belonging to specific, to some kind of different kinds of identity, to claim different identity formations, whether those are ones of gender, nationality, region, political allegiance, political belief structures, religious belief structures. This is so consonant with the late medieval world.
I've also read that they function like memes as well, which have a shared humor, but maybe understood differently, whether you're a fan or a critic of the person being parodied. And that's really interesting too to me, that they can have this kind of great ambivalence as well as being an so it's an identification for you, either distance or proximity from a figure, and that it's a shared humor, but the humor may be understood differently by different constituents looking at the same meme. Yet we all kind of understand them, but we might understand what they're doing differently.
I think that the symbolic regime of that the symbolic representational regime that we all live in is basically fundamentally about ambiguity and ambivalence.
Yeah,
things aren't fixed.
Did you read that article? There's medieval images since in the last 5 years, I guess, there's been a proliferation of digital medieval imagery opening up as free resources online. And there's a guy that was a marketing student that realized that he got this huge resource of free, funny art that he could use, and has been pumping out medieval memes with, which is kind of really interesting. That he was very consciously doing that because he realized they had a similar role then. And suddenly he had access to all this free material.
But neither one of you is connecting it to literacy, right? As literacy rates decline in the modern world, emojis and memes rise.
That's a point I make that I don't make very strongly in my book, but I am making increasingly, having finished it, which is that I don't think we understand visual literacy in the late medieval world very well. Yeah. I think we underestimate it constantly, and that one of the things that really, really needs to be explored more and researched more thoroughly is how and why literacy, so linguistic literacy, vernacular linguistic literacy, rises precipitously in the late Middle Ages, along with and alongside of and very sophisticated visual literacy as well. Because that's one thing that you see when you look at a lot of these badges, is they require a sophisticated decoder, a sophisticated looker. And we are assuming that basically everyone in that world knew how to read these visual images. So you see visual sophistication and linguistic, so visual literacy and linguistic vernacular literacy going hand in hand.
Yeah. In a way that we don't think of intuitively, right? We're too bound by our own structures. Listen, we've had a number of people ask for the name of the catalog that you both alluded to. Could you repeat it more slowly, please? And we'll put it in the chat.
Hannah, do you have it?
No, she doesn't.
Okay.
Sorry.
Badges.
You can't, there's no link to buy it. You have to email the museum and ask for it. And then they have to tell you how much it is in your local currency. And then you have to do PayPal. It's not, you can't just buy it online. Not from the UK anyway. It's a German museum.
Okay.
It's the Europäisches Hansa Museum, and I will put, I will just give you Andre, if you're here, I've got here, I can do this.
Anne-Marie's going to post it for us. Thanks, you two.
And I just read the thing about stickers, and I think they definitely function in a similar way. And also to do with the technology, the fact is that you can print stickers now very easily through digital printing. So students you know, a lot of activists use stickers, a lot of students commission stickers and print their own. They're very cheap to get printed now. And so they've kind of re-emerged as identifiers too.
No, not, no, okay, this is, okay, we have in the chat, Hannah, we have in the chat, this is an autocorrect problem. Whenever I type the German word Tragezeichen with a T, autocorrect changes it to Fragezeichen, which means question mark in German. So this is an ongoing problem, but Hannah is.
There we are.
You will also post the, Hannah, it's not your fault. This happens to me constantly in my messages, but if you can, Hannah, if there, yeah, and also the URL.
It's, yeah, the book, it just says there is a catalogue available, but there isn't a purchase page, as I said.
So,
and Anne-Marie, there was some question early on in your presentation about those residing outside of North America having difficulty buying the book through Penn, and that there's going to be some assistance provided to them, I think. Can they contact you if they have a hard time?
Just email me and I'll try to figure.
Everyone who wants to get it who's not in North America, just email Anne-Marie and she will get you in touch with the press. And
I'll send you the, yeah. Hannah, would you give them the www? Would you, I can't.
Yeah.
Is it there?
I see the Hansa Museum. Yeah, it's there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you. Yeah. So.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Anne-Marie, I'm looking at the time. You wanted this wound down by 2:15. Is that okay? Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. Then I think this has been phenomenal. It was an amazing discussion. Melanie, your artwork is just gorgeous. And I'm so pleased. So pleased that we had a chance to see how modernity is intersecting with the Middle Ages in such exciting and visually sumptuous ways. I wish that I could get over to the UK and see it in person. The screen is a poor second best, but really, really, really interesting to see how an artist's eye is interpreting this historical material. Anne-Marie, I have read the book. I love the book. I look forward to receiving an autographed copy of the book and to hosting a book launch for you. And perhaps many of us will join the book launch. Maybe we'll do a virtual and an in-person book launch this fall, and we can continue the conversation there. So I want to thank both of our speakers for a really, really stimulating Tuesday afternoon, and wish everybody safety and good health. And thank you all so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Lovely to talk to you, Anne-Marie, as well. It's great. So long as you've spoken.
So much fun. Yeah, a lot of fun.